Hi there, Michael here. I recently bought a new MacBook that I'm currently setting up, and I thought this would be a great opportunity to show you my minimal setup for audio plugins, especially those for immersive audio. Because of what I do on this channel, my plugin folders tend to get cramped pretty quickly, but since this is a fresh computer, everything is still in its initial state, with only the most important plugins installed. And that's exactly what we are going to explore today. I'm going to walk you through my freshly installed plugin folder and show you all the plugins I consider essential for working with spatial audio. We'll look at both traditional stereo plugins as well as immersive audio plugins. So without further ado, let's open up a digital audio workstation and check out my plugins. Before I get started, a very quick disclaimer. This is not a sponsored video. However, some of the plugins I'll show you were provided to me with a reviewer's license. I will mention that when we discuss those specific ones. Now, let's open up my favorite digital audio workstation for working with multi-channel audio, and that is, of course, Reaper. Now, in case you're wondering what digital audio workstation I usually use, that is actually Ableton, even though it's only stereo. I started out with Ableton and I know it the best. I know every trick that there is, and that's why I usually tend to use Ableton. If it's a multi-channel project, however, I tend to use Reaper these days because it just can do everything that you throw at it. So it's really the most complete and most flexible digital audio workstation out there. When I set up a new laptop, I usually also add Studio One and Nuendo, and then if it's a Mac, I also add Logic, because for some reason I think a Mac without Logic is just not a real Mac. Now, after a while, I actually have pretty much every digital audio workstation installed on my laptop, and that is because I simply need them for my videos. The one digital audio workstation that I try to avoid the most is Pro Tools. That is not because I dislike Pro Tools, it is because I dislike the Avid Link software, the software that keeps Pro Tools updated. It's just extremely annoying. You cannot get rid of it, and it always comes back if you trick it out of your system. So it's really annoying, and that's why I usually try to avoid installing Pro Tools, but quite frankly, after a while I need it too, and then essentially ends up on my system. So let's now check out my plugins, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go through the individual developers and I'm just going to show you the VST3 versions. Now, for some of these plugins I'm actually going to open them, but don't expect any tutorial about how to use these plugins. There are just too many. If you want me to do a dedicated video about one of those plugins, let me know and I can certainly do that, but in this video I just go through them and just tell you what I use. So the first set of plugins is from Acorn Digital, and it is a set of restoration plugins. If you are not familiar with those, I highly recommend checking them out. They are a really good alternative to Isotopes RX. They're much cheaper and they do their job really, really well. And the one reason I installed it immediately is because especially the Declick plugin gets rid of my mouse clicks. So I tend to have a very clicky voice, and with that plugin I actually can get rid of that. And that's why they end up immediately after I install a new laptop. The second plugin I install immediately is APL Virtuoso. Now, if you've been watching my channel for a while, you know that I use that a lot. APL Virtuoso is a binaural renderer. It takes in multi-channel audio, and the nice thing is that it actually has a lot of different options for input. So it can take anything up to 22.2 Hamasaki layout, and then essentially kind of renders it binaurally. And the nice thing is, there are actually a couple of nice things. First of all, it does have a head tracking feature, so you can natively use it with a head tracker. And then the second thing is it also exists in standalone mode, so I can also use it as an external binaural renderer. And one feature I should not forget is that it exists also on the Windows system. So if you are using Virtuoso, you can use that on a Mac as well as on Windows, and it works on both systems fine. So the next set of plugins, and I'm going to jump over the Apple ones because those are just there by default. The next set of plugins is from Audio Brewers. Now, I do really like Audio Brewers plugins, and I have to disclose here that I get all my Audio Brewers plugins for free for reviewing them. So just be aware of that. I tend to first only install the encoder and the decoder, as well as the rotator and the visualizer. These are the basic plugins that you need in order to work with Ambisonics. So what they essentially do is they take in any type of multi-channel audio and convert it into Ambisonics up to 7th order Ambisonics, and then essentially the decoder essentially decodes that back, and you can decode it back to binaural. I really like those plugins. They are the most flexible ones, and they work actually, for me at least, the best when it comes to Ambisonics. Now, there are a lot of different Ambisonics plugins out there, and towards the end of the life of my laptop, usually I have a whole range of different Ambisonics plugins on my system. But the Audio Brewers ones are the ones that I always start out with. And those are the ones that I can highly, highly, highly recommend. They're really, really great and very, very flexible. And the developer is very responsive and brings out new plugins all the time. And there are a couple of really innovative plugins in the Aubrey suite as well, like kind of delay plugins and reverb plugins and all kinds of things. In the end, I'm going to install all of them, but I usually start out with encoder, decoder, rotator, and visualizer. So the next plugin on my list is Audio Future's Walk Mix Creator, and what is hidden behind that is actually the Sony 360 Real Audio development tool. So this allows you to create Sony 360 audio, and even though I don't usually use it that much, I have it on my system. First of all, it is expensive, and I actually bought it, so I have a sort of moral obligation to also put it on my system. And then the second thing is I quite often get questions about it, so even though I don't use it that often, I sometimes need to load it up in order to be able to answer questions. Now, the way the Walk Mix Creator works is actually a little bit different to the other immersive audio development plugins, and that is that you actually can use it both as a receiver as well as the sender of your immersive audio. And the way this works is that you first put the Walk Mix Creator or one instance of the Walk Mix Creator on your master track. It will then ask you if that's the one on your master track, and you say yes, and then you put another version or another instance of the Walk Mix Creator on any other track that you want to send into the plugin instance of the master track. And once you do that, you essentially have the Walk Mix Creator set up. And that then allows you to create Sony 360 audio. It's not really used that much anymore, but what it really ends up doing is it's creating an MPEG-H format audio. So it's actually a lot more flexible than people think it is. Nevertheless, I have it on my system, not quite sure if I would install it if I wouldn't have this YouTube channel. It's really only there in case somebody has any questions. So the next one is the Audio Movers Binaural Renderer, and that's actually a really interesting plugin because what it allows you to do, it allows you to take the Apple AirPods or actually any Apple headphones with head tracking enabled or with how they call it, the personalized spatial audio enabled. So those are the AirPods Pro and the regular AirPods and the Beats Power Beats, and then there's another Beats earbuds that also works with those, and the AirPods Max. So if you use those, you can use them with the binaural renderer for Apple Music, and what it will do is it will essentially take in 7.1.4 audio and then essentially kind of play it back in personalized spatial audio with those headphones. And that's actually a really nice solution. I have a couple of other solutions that do the same, but the Audio Movers binaural renderer is the most flexible. I wouldn't say the most flexible. It's the easiest to use. You just pop it on your master track and you're done. And that actually works quite well. Okay, so let's go down our list a little further. There are a couple of plugins now that I tend to use just for stereo development. I like to use Baby Audio Smooth Operator. For some reason, that smooths out my voice the best. I have a very peaky voice in certain frequencies. Transits 2 is a multi-effects plugin that I like a lot. Then I have Boom Interactive. Boom Interactive is something that I primarily use for recenter. If you've watched my videos where I work with AI-generated tracks, you know that some AI-generated tracks sometimes go off-center, and Boom Interactive Recenter allows me to recenter that. I also have the Lift FX plugin on there, and that is a plugin that allows you to create lift effects, so it's kind of more for transitions. I like to use that a lot. Then I think there's nothing here in Cocos. Then we have Dada Live. These are really old plugins, but for some reason I really like them. Endless Smile and Sausage Fattener. Sausage Fattener is a gooderizer, so it kind of makes any audio sound better. I'm not quite sure how it does it, but it does it. And then Endless Smile is sort of a kind of also a transition plugin that allows you to kind of put kind of transition effects. That's something I like a lot. Now, one of the more recent plugins is, for me at least, is Perfect Room 2 from Denise Audio. That is a very flexible, creative reverb plugin. I actually like to use that a lot. It's a relatively new plugin though, so I'm not quite sure if it's going to stand up to the the test of time, but at least for now, I really like to use that a lot. Okay, then we come to Devious Machines. Devious Machines are primarily used for duck. That is a ducking plugin, a plugin that allows you to create sidechaining effects. There are a couple of those out there. For some reason, I like to use the Devious Machines one. And then also Infiltrator, which is another multi-effects plugin that I also kind of like to use a lot. And then we get to the more interesting things. First of all, we have the Dolby stuff. Now, of course, I have the Dolby Atmos renderer on my system here. And with the Dolby Atmos renderer, we get, of course, the music panner and the LTC generator, because we need those if you're working with the external Dolby Atmos renderer. Then I have the Embody Immerse Virtual Studio Signature Edition. And for that, actually, the main reason I installed it is primarily because of the Apple Music version. So if I'm actually going to send in 7.1.4 into the Immerse Virtual Studio Edition, and I have the Apple Music license, I can actually also use the head tracking with the Apple AirPods Pro inside the Immersive Virtual Studio Signature Edition from Embody. And that gives generally a very, very good impression. So I actually like to use that once in a while. It's not something I use very, very often, but it is actually a nice piece of software. So I can only recommend that one. Okay, and with that, back to the more traditional plugins, and that is, of course, FabFilter. I have everything from FabFilter. These are by far the best plugins, the general purpose plugins that you can get. And one thing that not a lot of people really know is the fact that these are actually multi-channel plugins. So if I'm using Pro-Q, for example, on a 16-channel track, I actually have a multi-mono plugin that can work on all 16 channels. And that is also true for things like the Reverb plugin, Pro R2, which is a very capable multi-channel reverb. So if you have the FabFilter tool set, if you have the entire kind of set of plugins, this is really everything you need in order to work with multi-channel audio. It provides everything that you could ask for up to 16 channels. So if you go beyond 16 channels, obviously this is not enough, but for up to 16 channels, that's really everything you need in terms of plugins. Now, the next one is probably my most often used plugin, and that is the Fiedler Audio Dolby Atmos Composer. I usually install both versions, the free Essentials version and the paid version, simply because I sometimes want to demonstrate things with the free version. I also have the Spacelab Reverb and the Gravitas Compressor plugin. Now, I need to point out that some of those I actually got for free as reviewers licenses, especially Gravitas and the Dolby Atmos Composer itself. I actually purchased Spacelab Interstellar myself. And those are really the plugins that I use most when it comes to Dolby Atmos. And if you are interested in working with immersive audio, if you're interested in getting started with Dolby Atmos, I highly, highly recommend those. So those are probably, I would say, my absolute must-haves. So if there's anything that you need, these are the ones that you probably need. So the next one is a plugin that is really only there in order to link to another piece of software that I have on my Mac, and that is Ginger Audio Ground Control Sphere. What Ground Control Sphere is really a virtual monitor controller that allows you to essentially kind of work with multiple monitor setups. And one thing that it does really, really well is also head tracking. So if you're working with Apple AirPods, for example, Ginger Audio Ground Control Sphere is the only one that allows you to take in 9.1.6 audio and essentially then use head tracking and Apple AirPods in order to render that binaurally. And what they have is a link plugin that allows you to also link directly into Ginger Audio Ground Control Sphere, and that's why it's on my system. So it's a little bit of an expensive software. I made a couple of videos about it. I'm going to leave some links in the description, but kind of if you are serious about immersive audio, that might be a piece of software that you might want to get. Okay, the next ones are more traditional ones. First of all, we have the iZotope suite. I have the Ozone 11 installed and RX 11 installed. I have pretty much everything from iZotope, but usually I start out installing only Ozone and RX. Over time, kind of sometimes other things creep in, but those are the ones that I use regularly and use actually very, very often. Next is the first synthesizer. Now, when it comes to synthesizers, I usually install the ones first where I have the most preset packs, and the first one here is from Vengeance Sound Avenger. It's one that I really like, and a lot of people agree with me, so that's one that I can only recommend. It is not an immersive synthesizer, but sometimes you have to have something just for stereo as well. Then we have the first real reverb, and that is Cinematic Rooms Professional from Liquid Sonics. If you want to have a realistic sounding reverb, in my opinion, that is the best one that you can get. There are others out there, but for me personally, that one kind of meets the kind of the sweet spot between kind of professionalism and at the same time being not overly expensive. It is an expensive plugin, but it is not that super expensive compared to other solutions out there. And it's a really good plugin that if you are working with immersive audio, I can only recommend. And then we have a really interesting one, and that is Novo Notes. Essentially, I have actually I have more plugins from Novo Notes, but the two that I usually install first are 3DX and the HBL processor. Now, the HBL processor is just a binaural processor that does the same thing that 3DX does, but just in a simpler way. 3DX, and I did a lot of videos about 3DX, is a very capable panning plugin. So you have all kinds of options here when it comes to kind of panning almost anything into almost everything. So I can, for example, use that in order to pan Aura 7.1.6 into, I don't know, something crazy, like for example 5.1.4. And then essentially I can pan that. Let me just kind of turn on the advanced thing here, and I can kind of move that around and kind of position the audio, kind of scale it a little, and kind of change also the position, and then kind of move that around the listener. So it is extremely capable, extremely flexible. It is not exactly cheap, but if you are in the market for a panning plugin that can do almost anything, this is a good option. Now, as I said before, I also have the HBL processor, which is just a simplified version. So what this really does is it just kind of is a binaural renderer. So I can do the same things or almost the same things. The only difference is it just kind of does a binaural rendering, and that simplifies everything. So sometimes, kind of you don't really need a full panning plugin. A binaural renderer is fine. So that's why I usually install both immediately after I get a new PC or a laptop or MacBook or whatever. So let's go further down our list. Now, first we have Oxon Soothe, and that's a plugin that I'm honestly not completely sure. Sometimes I like it, sometimes I hate it. It ended up being useful whenever I do any tracks with artificial intelligence, because AI tracks tend to have something weird going on in the higher frequencies, and at least I feel that Soothe can help with that. But, you need to be really careful with Soothe, because you can mess up your audio completely if you don't use it correctly. But, it's one that I always install immediately. Then we have Plogue Bidule, and here we have the VST3 version. Plogue Bidule is kind of a very capable node-based plugin that allows you to construct all kinds of things. And if you're working with immersive audio, that is one thing that I also recommend that you actually have, because if there's anything out there, or if you want to do anything where you can't find a plugin, you can use Plogue Bidule in order to construct that for you. It allows you to put in all kinds of things, from different types of plugins to devices and kind of modulation devices and mixing devices and all kinds of processing devices. So it's almost like a node-based programming environment that allows you to build your own plugins. It also has a standalone version, and the standalone version can be particularly useful if you want to work in ways with immersive audio that a regular digital audio workstation can't. So if you are in immersive audio, that's definitely, in my opinion at least, a must-have. Plogue Bidule. Now, the next one is one that I really only have on my system because of Sam Hawking's Eno plugin. If you're not familiar with Eno is the immersive nulling upmixer, and it is a plugin that allows you to take in stereo audio and upmix that to 9.1.6 in a way that keeps the original stereo intact. So if you downmix it again, or if you fold it down, it actually kind of nulls completely. And I'm a big fan of Eno, and I've did a video in the past. I'm going to leave a link in the description. And because Sam Hawking implemented that as a plug data patch, I have to have plug data on the system. Okay, then we have a couple of more traditional plugins. First of all, Process Audio, Decibel. That is my favorite monitoring or kind of measuring plugin, really. It's really flexible. I really like it. It shows everything that you need to have. There's also a standalone version that you can use, so you can run it externally. It's really great. And in addition to that, I also have Sugar. Sugar is a good eraser. Essentially, what it does is it allows you to kind of do some quick and dirty mastering. That's really what it does. It's a plugin that I like, so I just have that on my system. Then we have another synth, Nexus. And if you are not familiar with Nexus, Nexus started out as a Rompler, really. So it was more of a plugin that allowed you to kind of use all kinds of samples it was really kind of meant to be a sample-based synthesizer. It wasn't really a full synthesizer. But they recently upgraded Nexus, and it's now a really capable synth that has everything that you want a synth to have. So you can access all the different things that you would like to access in a synthesizer, and at least in my opinion, it's now one of the most capable and best synthesizers that you can get. And most importantly, I have a lot of presets for that one, so that's why I always installed it on my system. It also takes up a lot of space on my system because I have so many presets. And then I also have Vanguard on my system. That's a relatively old synthesizer that they recently brought back, and it's a really nice one. And it comes with all the presets that they originally had, so it's actually a lot of things that you get with that one for relatively cheap. So I can only recommend that one. So the next one is another reverb plugin, this time from Reverb Foundry, and that is sold by Liquid Sonics, Tai Chi. The reason I usually always install that is because it is a more creative reverb, and it is an immersive reverb, so it can work with multi-channel audio, but in a way that is a little bit more creative. So it's not like Cinematic Rooms where it tries to be as accurate as possible. Tai Chi is a little bit kind of more playful and allows you to do all kinds of things. The next ones are a little bit more traditional again. So we have from Softube, the Weiss de-esser. That's actually my favorite de-esser. If you're looking for a really, really good de-esser, I can highly recommend it. It's once again not exactly cheap, but it's a really good one. I also like the Mastering Maximizer that always also finds its way immediately on my systems. And then I always also have at least one Pultec kind of EQ. And here I installed the TubeTech EQ from Softube, which is once again a Pultec EQ. Now I tend to stay away from Softube plugins because I don't really like their installer system. For some reason that never worked with me, but because the Weiss plugins are so nice, I usually kind of end up installing them immediately. And then we have Soniball. Now, with Soniball, I usually start out only with the two measuring plugins, True Balance and True Level. And those are just plugins that allow me to kind of see if everything on my track is the way it's supposed to be. I do have all the other Soniball plugins as well. And as an Austrian, I feel almost kind of a obligation to kind of install those. But I usually don't install them immediately. These usually come in a little bit later. So the Smart EQ and the Smart Compressor and everything, they're absolutely fantastic plugins. But I usually don't really need them, so I only start out with the True Balance and the True Level plugin, and then essentially add the other ones later when I'm starting to actually kind of do some really serious stuff. The next plugin is actually my favorite plugin when it comes to stereo production, and that is from Sound Theory Gullfoss. I'm actually one of the first Gullfoss users. I bought that plugin very, very early, and it has been on my system ever since, and I don't think there's a single track where I didn't use it. It is a really, really excellent plugin that allows you to kind of smooth out any inconsistencies in your audio in a way that actually makes sense. So once again, super interesting, super highly recommended plugin, super useful, and perfect for almost anything. Now, the next plugins I only have on the system because I've installed Cubase. So with Cubase and Nuendo, there are all kinds of plugins that come with them. And these are kind of here. I usually don't use them, but once again, because I installed Cubase, they're on here. Then we have from Stephen Slade VSX. I actually have the VSX headphones and I like them. I'm not really using them as often anymore as I used to, but they are good headphones, and this is a good mixing system. So if you want to do that, if you want to kind of have some sort of help with mixing, that's certainly one way to go. I once did a video where I compared all kinds of different mix room simulations, and that has become a very popular video. So I do get questions about it once in a while. That's why I have all these systems on my laptop. But these days I actually rarely use it anymore. I actually have other options now that I prefer. Okay, then we have the Subaware binaural. That is a binaural renderer that comes with the Subaware Head Tracker. Actually, it's a free plugin that you can download, but it only really makes sense if you have the Subaware Head Tracker. And it's a really convenient way of doing binaural rendering with head tracking, because all you really need is load that plugin, connect your head tracker, and that's everything there is to it. I did a couple of videos about the Subaware Head Tracker. Once again, I'm going to leave some links in the description below. It is a free plugin, kind of doesn't hurt. And the Subaware Head Tracker is actually a very inexpensive head tracker. So if you're interested in getting started with head tracking, that is actually an excellent solution. Next one is Synapse Audio Dune, my absolute favorite synthesizer. I'm not quite sure why. It just kind of sounds the best to me. I really liked it. And then the HIM Kick Ninja. I also need at least one kick synthesizer, and I kind of I have a couple of those, and I tend to sometimes use one over the other. And most recently, I'm gravitating towards Kick Ninja. But at least you need at least one kick synth. That's really kind of where it comes from. So let's finish up with a couple of traditional stereo plugins. First of all, I have almost the entire UV suite. I do not have the subscription, but I believe it or not, I purchased almost everything over time. And, it comes with a lot of plugins, and these are actually really nice. UV for me personally has become the go-to ecosystem when it gets to samples. If I need a piano or a certain synthesizer, I usually kind of gravitate towards UV. I used to use a lot of native instruments. I'm not really doing that anymore. You might have noticed that there was no native instruments in here, and that is because UV actually gives me everything that I need, and I find it more convenient. And plus, it kind of, instead of Kontakt, which I find a little bit bothersome, you can use all the sounds within the Falcon synthesizer, and that's really that's really great, and I really like that. Now, Vengeance, we already talked about that. Then we have Vital Audio. I like the Vital synthesizer, but to be perfectly honest, I mainly install it because I have a couple of preset packs that I really like a lot from Demis Hellen. These are really, really great, and that's why I install it. And then finally, last but not least, Trackspacer, which is another plugin that helps me smooth out my mixes. It essentially, what it does is it allows you to duck one track underneath another track, and it does that in a frequency kind of way. There are many plugins these days that try to do the same thing. However, I still believe that Trackspacer is the best, and that completes my setup. Well, that's everything for today. If you have any questions, drop them in the comments or join our free Discord server. The invite link is in the description below. I'm particularly interested in hearing what plugins you consider essential. How would your selection look? Let me know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to stay updated on all things Dolby Atmos and immersive audio. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video.